A century ago, 1919, the German Workers' Party was formed. Adolf Hitler was an early adopter. 1929, Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini's fascism took the world by storm. 1939, World War II was launched by Germany's unprovoked attack on Poland. 1949, apartheid was declared official policy in South Africa. 1959, Fidel Castro became president for life of Cuba. 1969, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. 1979, 3 Mile Island nuclear plant suffered a terrifying, though partial, meltdown. 1989, protesters in China's Tiananmen Square were quickly silenced. 1999, the world was about to end as our computers rolled us into 0, 0, 0, 0. 2009, in the depths of a recession, we inaugurated our first black president. 2019. What will they say about us? We would like to imagine that the world is a kinder, gentler place, more hospitable than a century ago. After all, the events of the last 100 years have surely convinced us of the dangers of nationalism and military aggression, the inhumanity of oppressing people because of race or religion. Surely we have been inspired by the possibilities of cooperative research, the emergence of sustainable energy resources, a better understanding of artificial intelligence and what it would mean to live globally. Instead, we have only replaced those infamous names from the history books with new infamous names and new, deadlier isms than the old ones. New dictators rise to power and stoke ancient antagonisms. Racism and anti-Semitism march our streets. Remember Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us? Was there a darker day? We no longer have to drop nuclear weapons. Guns are far more efficient, expensive, and available. Money for shared research has evaporated, and what some call woke sounds a lot like anger from the other side of the aisle. We are as divided in this country, I fear, as we have ever been. And we gather in this difficult, dangerous, troubling environment to claim something that sent some Christians to their deaths. We say that Christ is King. In 1925, an astute and frightened Pope Pius XI launched a brand new festival that had not been done for about 6 centuries. It was a bold public statement of opposition to the world's corrupt rulers and the world's dark powers. Christ is King, he said, not Hitler, not Mussolini, not Castro, not al-Assad, not El Chapo in our time. Christ is King, not Nazism or fascism or anti-Semitism or racism or nationalism. Christ is King, not fear or hatred, poverty or homelessness, abuse or addiction, enslavement or imprisonment, disdain or despair. Christ is King. What was he thinking? One of the reasons it is so difficult for the world and even for us to recognize and acknowledge the absolute lordship of Jesus Christ, the unassailable power of God, is that it doesn't sound or smell like lordship. It doesn't walk or talk like a duck. Pope Pius XI could have suggested other reading material for this homemade festival of his that might have inspired us a little more. Perhaps we could have read an Old Testament story about how God's people annihilated all the armies that came up against them, like that God. Maybe we could have read an epistle reading from Paul, who loved to throw carefully written verbal hand grenades at his opponents. We love that stuff. Maybe we could have read a gospel text about Jesus flipping furniture in the temple, shouting down demons, humiliating the temple hierarchy. That's a God we could get our arms around. That's a Christ who inspires allegiance, military power, righteous anger, public shaming. Would it be easier to gather on Christ the King Sunday if that was the king we worshiped? We say, Christ is king and he's not happy. I fear Pope Pius XI missed an opportunity. But our king, naked, beaten, parched, bleeding, humiliated, unrecognizable even to his own mother. Who would recognize him as a king? But it could have been so different. 3 times in this morning's gospel reading, Jesus was invited to save himself, to free himself from the cross. 3 times he refused. We have every reason to believe it was in Jesus' power to do that, to free himself from the cross, to save himself, to rain fire down on his accusers, to establish a new political movement, a new religious mandate. But he did not. He chose not to. Not for his sake, but for ours. 2 things happened on the cross that day that mark Jesus a king like no other, a king unrecognizable to any but those who listen closely. Looking down from the cross at the mob that cheered his dying, he whispered, Father, forgive them. Forgive them. They have no idea what they're doing. Before they knew they had sinned, before they knew to beg for mercy, already forgiven by the very one whom they had tortured to death. Our King forgives those who persecute him. And the second quiet word from the cross, another prayer. The prayer of a dying man. Remember me? That's all he asked. Remember me? And our King said, yes, I will. I will remember you. I remember you today. I will remember you for eternity. These are the proclamations of a king. I forgive you. I remember you. Friday night, the church building was electric with energy as we participated in the world's big sleep out. Giant Jenga blocks crashed to the floor. Adults who should know better cheated at Go Fish. How desperate is that? Letters were penned to our legislators. Ziploc bags were stuffed with blessings. Cardboard art invited us to consider home, and a tent city grew on our lawn. And the snores of the few who were able to sleep irritated the many who couldn't. We were also privileged to meet some of our ministry partners who provide hands-on care for the homeless right here in Northfield and also in Chicago. We were inspired and we were convicted. Inspired by the reality that things could be different. And convicted by the fact that we could make that happen. Does Jesus, the King, forgive us when we fail to care for the lost and the least? Does Jesus remember us when we forget? Can we be forgiven for failing to see the poor among us? There are hungry students in our hyper-performing schools. Do we see them? There are low-wage workers at the place where you get your coffee. Do you know their names? Can we be forgiven for judging the undereducated for their lack of expertise, the underemployed for their lack of a briefcase, the underhoused for their lack of hygiene? Our King says, yes, yes, I can forgive you. I already have. And then he promises to remember us, all of us, those of us who are well-fed, well-bred, well-read, and those of us who struggle to survive, who wonder why we are alive, who fail to thrive. It is tempting to lament that we will always have the poor with us, that the powers of the world and the needs of its people will always be at odds. But if, as your financial advisor will tell you, past performance is no predictor of future results, perhaps our life going forward could be different. We could move into a new century marked not by war, but by peace that we create. Not by fear of the stranger, but by acknowledgement that that person is our brother or sister. Not by isolation, but by arms open wide. Perhaps in the decades to come, the world will learn of and come to love our King. A King who quietly forgives all who sin. A King who faithfully remembers even those whom we forget.